Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society, the economy, real estate, medicine, technology, and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Plow. I'm the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, a 501c3 National American charitable organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva and Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a model of coexistence, as it serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. Please support our mission. Join our community of friends. Visit American Friends of Rabin Medical Center via our website and social media outlets on Twitter and Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube, and on our Facebook page and discussion group.
Today's Global Connections topic is People versus Technology, Who's Winning? Thank you to our very special guest, Professor Sherry Turkle of MIT's Social Studies of Science and Technology, Nicholas Carr, former executive editor, Harvard Business Review, and Dr. Virginia Heffernan, columnist, LA Times, The Economist, and Wired. And now, Global Connections with Robert Siegel.
Thank you, Josh. We're interested today in the technologies that connect us, smartphone to smartphone, person to thousands of persons at one time. These are the technologies that enable us to Zoom through work and school and family gatherings, permit us to read online and listen to music and shop. Even though as we do all these things, we know that we're leaving behind a digital footprint that can easily be inspected and exploited. These are technologies that have changed how we interact. And the question for us is, for better or for worse, who's winning, people or technology? And what difference has the pandemic made? Our panel consists of three very compelling and provocative writers with different views of our relations to the digital realm. And we start with very prominent techno-pessimist, I would call him, the writer Nicholas Carr, who joins us from Williamstown, Massachusetts. Nick Carr has been warning against the seductive, but he would argue injurious allure of the internet ever since 2008, when he wrote a cover story for The Atlantic titled, "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" In both that article and also in his subsequent book, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, his answer was an emphatic yes. Reading online as we do, hopping from one topic to another, yielding to all sorts of intentional planted distractions, we are losing both the practice of and even the physiological capability for solitary contemplative thought and reading. And Nick Carr, do I have the thesis down in a nutshell at least?
That's exactly right. Yes.
And as you note in the epilogue to a new edition of The Shallows, you were writing about desktops and laptops. At that point, the iPhone was something novel still. How big today is the mobile revolution as a factor in our lives?
I think it's huge. It's, you know, when I wrote the book came out in 2010 and the iPhone was introduced in 2007. So as you said, it was novel then. It was clear that the smartphone would take the place of cell phones, other cell phones. What wasn't clear at the time is that it would take the place of personal computers. It would become the dominant form of personal computers over the next 10 years. And what's different is that now we have this connected device, small connected device that we keep on our person, really almost from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep. And what we do on it, more than anything else, I think, is engage with social media, which was also novel back just 10 years ago. So I think it's really changed our relationship with the technology and made it much more intimate. The experience of being online, you can't even separate from what we call offline now. It's completely interpenetrated.
And this is something that crosses lines of generation and of class. It's pervasive.
That's right. I'm uncomfortable with the common kind of generational view of the technology that says the problems that it creates or the benefits it provides are concentrated among the young. I certainly think the patterns of use are different in different generations, but I think everyone uses the technology in very similar ways at a high level. We're all distracted by it. We're all increasingly dependent on it. So this is something that influences everyone from 10-year-olds to 90-year-olds.
Nick, what's different about today's pandemic of smartphone addiction, to which I'll admit I have bouts of this. What's different between that and other claims that have been made over the years that everything from television to comic books to Mad Magazine to the fast cuts of Sesame Street are all undermining the powers of concentration of the young? Yeah,
and I think it's important to be cognizant of all of those criticisms in the past, some of which turned out to be true, some of which turned out to be overblown. What I think is different is we've never had a technology, particularly a media technology or a communication technology, that we're so involved in minute by minute throughout our days. And you can see from studies that the average person with a smartphone is checking it somewhere between 80 and 100, 150 times a day, every few minutes, and often for just brief bursts. So for instance, if you compare it to TV, back when people were concerned about televisions were boxes, fairly large boxes that often sat in people's living rooms. And yeah, people watched it a lot, looked at it a lot, but their concentration on the television was segregated into particular times of the day. We called prime time in the evening prime time because that's when most people watch TV. The rest of the day, you weren't constantly glancing at TV. You weren't carrying it around. So we've never had a technology that is so intrusive on our thoughts, on our perceptions, on our social relations as the smartphone and all the services it provides. So yeah, it's important to take account of the criticism that have come before, but this is really something that we haven't seen before.
So we've just come through a national science experiment, which is to say, here we had this technology at hand. Now let's try limiting social interactions to the barest minimum, not seeing our close relatives in many cases for months and months, working from home to the extent that we can. What's happened? What has been the difference, do you think, of the pandemic year in our relation with these technologies and in whatever permanent changes may be left after this year?
Yeah, and let me start with a positive note, because there's certainly not much that you would say was fortunate about the pandemic, but I do think it's fortunate that we had these tools of remote collaboration and remote socializing already available in quite an advanced state, and we had lots of experience using them. So when the pandemic hit and we had to become more socially isolated, we had already available in our pockets ways to collaborate and communicate. And I think the pandemic would have felt even more troubling and isolating and disorienting if we didn't have these powerful communication tools. That said, I think many of us, if not most of us, have become very aware of what's lacking in remote social groups, in remote work, remote schooling, remote socializing. We've gotten a lesson in the importance of physical presence. All the signals we read from each other, from the world around us, the kind of sensory richness of interacting in person, and that's been taken away from us to a large extent. Now, what is unknown, what I really don't know that's what's going to happen afterwards is whether we'll rebel against this remote virtual life when the pandemic, and hopefully it soon subsides, and kind of learn to set aside our phone more parts of the day and actually enjoy each other's presence, or whether, even though we realize the shortcomings of the technology, we'll have become so adapted so further adapted to relying on the technology for everyday interactions that will actually continue. I mean, certainly we're now using the technology more intensively than ever before, and we were using it intensively before. But where we go from here, I think, is an open question.
In the epilogue to the new edition of The Shallows that I mentioned, you cite a very interesting claim from an article in Scientific American that I was unaware of, and I confess I didn't go track down. But you say that the argument of this article was that people finding instant information from their mobile devices, from their smartphones, can mistake the power of the device for their own mental capacities, leading to a wonderful phrase, delusions of intelligence, you say, which raises an interesting question of if you knew everything that's on the internet, would that be intelligence? But leaving that question aside, you then propose the idea that perhaps this is why fake ideas, crazy conspiracy theories thrive on the internet, because everyone thinks he or she knows everything. They've got it in their pocket.
That's right. And the authors of that article, the way they summed it up is that we seem to be entering a time when people will think they know more about the world, even though they continually know less about the world. Because there's a very big difference in finding information online, Googling up information, and actually taking information into your mind and weaving it together with everything else you know. That's what creates personal knowledge, all those associations and connections between information. And those seem to be sacrificed when we just browse online and grab information. And what I think happens, and this is my theory anyway, is that we begin to lose our powers of discernment or have them blunted. And it becomes harder and harder for us to recognize what is true, what's reliable, and what's simply false, but that might fit with our preconceptions. So I think as a result of that, we've entered this crisis of gullibility, where people are more likely to believe stuff that is either distorted or simply untrue because they don't have a frame of reference, a frame of knowledge and internal intelligence to pass the new information through. And also, they're more likely to circulate that information, repost it, retweet it, in order to show off their own intelligence and knowledge, even though it's distorted and often wrong.
Just one other quick question. When you wrote The Shallows, and I interviewed you about it, the kids whom you're now teaching in college would have been entering school, I guess. And I wondered at the time when we spoke, was the problem with how people read on the internet or now on their mobile devices something that those of us who learned to read the printed page were having, because it was a transition? Would a generation raised entirely or preponderantly in this new medium, would they find the same problems, or would they master it? So now that you have a class of members of that generation who came up with these things, have they taken all this in stride better than us old folks have?
Well, I think they're certainly more adept at using the social tools of social media and the internet. I think they, like everyone else, I think they struggle with their dependence on the technology and the way it does constantly grab their attention and sometimes produces anxiety. They're fearful of what people are saying about them or fearing they're not seeing anything. So I want to emphasize, I don't think the effects are hugely different between generations. And I certainly don't think that younger people, simply because they've grown up with the technology, have mastered how to use it in a way that gives you attentiveness and allows you to build up rich knowledge. Because I think what happens is that the way our minds create knowledge is in direct conflict with the way the technology delivers information. And just because you use it more doesn't mean that's going to overcome that fundamental conflict.
Well, Nick Carr, thanks. Next up, Virginia Heffernan. Virginia Heffernan takes a much more positive view of the internet. She's a columnist for the Los Angeles Times, for Wired, and she writes for The Economist's 1843 magazine. She used to write for the New York Times, where one of her assignments, among many, was As a television critic, she's a Harvard PhD in English literature. And to her, that jumble of multimedia distractions that alarms critics like Nick Carr is, to the contrary, a work of art. The internet presents aesthetics of our times. And in her book, Magic and Loss, The Internet as Art, Virginia Heffernan acknowledges that this is a work in progress, this particular work of art. And as for charges of assault on our capacity to contemplate, she declares the digital world innocent. Fair enough? And thank
certainly
you
innocent of assault. I mean, that's actually a perfect, yes, that is a perfect paraphrase.
I just want to clarify, it's not just that you acquit the internet of playing havoc with our brains. I mean, the pleasure you take in, say, Angry Birds and writing about Angry Birds more lyrically than I've seen anyone do, it's not a guilty pleasure. It's saying, hey, this is a masterpiece of an app game. I enjoy doing this, and there's something to it that works.
For gamers out there, I was once in the top 1,000 in the world on Angry Birds, but also I hasten to assure you that I don't play anymore.
Right.
It is important, though, I think, to just underscore that not everyone's using social media when they're using their phones. I mean, that social media, I think, is for many of us a small fraction of what we do with our phones. Lots of people are gaming on their phones. I think we were just talking about spelling bee on the New York Times app, the crossword, and that is that's a middle-aged person's game, and yet we would be shudder if we were called gamers, but that's what we're doing. And then, take it one step further, and you can go talk about the spelling bee on Twitter with the designer of the puzzle who calls everyone hive mind and participate in this kind of strange brew of syllables and hashtags, and that are just a mental pleasure, the way word games are. And then the other thing that the people I know, a lot of people I know are doing during this time are trading crypto on Robinhood. So, I get that, if you'd rather be reading the Critique of Pure Reason in German, that it's not very interesting to trade crypto. On the other hand, I mean, you feel your brain growing if you embrace something like Dogecoin, which, we're talking about what we're talking about, but a huge section of the internet is talking about nothing but the growth of this especially silly meme coin that is poised to make some people very rich. And trying to figure out what money is, what decentralized currency is. I mean, I did the new economic criticism, so-called, in graduate school, and nothing has been as interesting as seeing the rise of these very destabilizing but stimulating new currencies.
You make a very interesting assertion in the book Magic and Loss, and you recall the speech, famous statement by Newton Minow, who was the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission under President Kennedy, and who declared American television to be a vast wasteland. We should add as a small footnote that since this in part led to public broadcasting, some of us lived for decades off of Newton Minow's accusation against television. But you said as much to Newton Minow, that by, as you would put it, putting a curse on television, he had done the best thing for television that had ever been done. And that today people have put perhaps Nick, you might have in mind, have put a curse on the internet. What is that?
I mean, I have to acknowledge the multiple chips on my shoulder, because when I came to the New York Times, I was writing about television. I sat next to the dance critic on one side, the architecture critic on the other. I certainly knew the film critics, the book critics. And mine was the only art in the culture department, the only art that was also a public health hazard, that elsewhere in the newspaper was treated as like a disease. And that only got worse when I moved to the magazine and started writing about the internet culture, which seemed like, a contradiction in terms. So yes, Newton, who is, that speech is terrific. He's done so much good, interesting work since. He essentially introduced the idea that some kind of media should be in the public interest, which is a phrase you see Jack Dorsey using on Twitter now. that certain tweets are or aren't in the public interest, which is very interesting. I think he's like, they there have gone back to some brass tacks established by the FCC, 50 plus years ago. But yes, I think that, because I came to the internet so young, it's a long story, but I did start on the internet in the end of ARPANET days as a kid. I thought of it as a kind of truancy, always. I never thought, and there are people who started working on Excel spreadsheets was their first touch of computers, and they thought of it as dreary. But I thought of it as, massively multiplayer online role-playing game. And it was 1981. And my mother was constantly yelling at me to get off the computer because I was tying up the one phone line using a coupler and a modem and all the things Professor Turkel's all too familiar with. And so I thought of it as something I shouldn't be doing. And so much of the internet, think of YouTube, is always like this close to pornography, or this, that one keystroke and you could end up on 8kun, on 8chan, on one of the dark sites, or that they're around. And so the feeling that you shouldn't be doing it, which is the same feeling that like animates sitting in a dark movie theater, or that you might get addicted to it. We don't have that feeling with Latin texts. You don't have the feeling, but that makes those practices of reading Latin, of reading Kant, slightly antiquarian, and that has its own satisfactions. But there's nothing like kind of bawdy Shakespeare where 1 minute away you could be in some sketchy territory. That stirs the art impulse.
But what about the idea that that excessive exposure to the toxic screen will ultimately limit your choices and rule out Kant, because you can't read it anymore. You've lost the ability to concentrate.
I mean, toxic and assault are perfect sort of words to, I think, press on a little bit. It seems always a bit dangerous to introduce physical metaphors like the poison metaphor to what is a symbolic order. I mean, we have to, as we're talking, keep ever present that, while I feel like I can see your face, I'm seeing really a representation of the face. I'm hearing a representation of the sound signal when you're talking. So there's not much chance that I could poison you through the screen, or that anything the screen is doing could poison you with words, images, music, sound. And there's like a not great history of thinking that, 19th century novels could poison the minds of young women. Literally that word poison all the time, toxic, intoxicating, they could make them sexual. There were worries that people, realist art would be so mesmerizing. There are always stories that the birds peck themselves to death on images because they're so realistic, or with the Lumiere brothers, that the train was going to hit them off the screen. And these things are ways of heightening the savor that, maybe in this massively multiplayer online role-playing game, you'll really believe you're a cleric, that somehow that it's going to reach out and grab you is, I think, a little bit of a scare tactic. That said, I have modified my position on this, and I do see particular physical dangers, not occult brain dangers, but dangers to vision, which I've been writing about now, to the fact that we're always recruiting the same muscles to look at our phones, cuts down on our peripheral vision and lots of other kind of moral senses that go with that. And then, of course, we're losing hearing with headphones, which is very alarming in kids. And then there's the hyperstimulation that's a somewhat different subject, but has been part of the internet from the beginning and may even be connected to a kind of semi-seizure response to screens.
And just one last point, how concerned are you that all of this activity, or much of this activity, is controlled by huge companies? You mentioned the head of Twitter as having spoken of a public interest. Yeah. But we've all been hearing a great deal about the private interests of huge companies that have great access to information about us. Does it worry you? And would it worry you that your kids are all over the web?
One of them is not at all. A pretty very strict Luddite who listens to vinyl and writes on he'll only use Google Docs in a hurry, writes in a pinch, writes on a typewriter. And that's a very, very clear reaction formation that I actually see in other kids too, getting flip phones, who've now especially come to associate their computers entirely with school. As for the data gouging, it is amazing that for so long we were balky about surveillance, and then we decided, what the hell, we'll just give it all to Facebook, give it to them. And that is troubling. At the same time, it doesn't seem like an accident to me that sort of mindfulness has made its way into our lives, and certain kinds of physical practices, everything from birding to yoga, that have kind of risen in tandem with the internet. And I think that's partly because what if we are not our information? I know it's hard to imagine, but we're not even our Citibank balances. Mm-hmm. And the kind of the worst that can happen with, quote, identity theft actually would siphon off everything that is not me. So in other words, the me that isn't my Twitter avatar feels realer and closer to me, and obviously more physical than my Twitter avatar. And when I'm attacked online, and I do get a lot of flack online, I try to remind myself that that happens there. Like, a bad day online is not a bad day in real life.
Well, Virginia Heffernan, thanks. Now, our third panelist is Professor Sherry Turkle of MIT, who I believe is an intellectual discipline unto herself. Her chair at MIT is in the social studies of science and technology. Her doctorate from Harvard is in both sociology and personality psychology. She's a licensed psychotherapist, and two subjects that have commanded her attention for decades are psychoanalysis and our relations with technology, especially computers. And she's the author most recently, she's the author of several best-selling books, but most recently, The Empathy Diaries, a memoir. And she joins us from Provincetown, Massachusetts. Hiya, Sherry. As I mentioned, you're a psychotherapist, and therapy and more so analysis entail a strong relationship between analyst and analysand, or therapist and whatever we say, patient or client, I don't know. How has that relationship survived the year of social distance?
Well, actually, therapists and analysts have been very quick to embrace, I would say, teletherapy, teleanalysis, because it's all they can do. I mean, it's what was possible during this year of all of our, I'll call it our confinement. And as they discuss it, as I am part of groups that are talking about what it's like to work with patients in this new context, I hear an echo of something that has been a leitmotif in my studies, actually, of the robot dog. Which is that people begin by saying, well, this is better than nothing. This is absolutely better than nothing, which of course it is. And then to take the example of the robot dog and then make an analogy, one young man who gave his grandmother an Aibo robot dog told me, well, the Aibo is better than nothing because my grandmother is allergic to dogs, so she has to have the robot. And then 3 months later, he said to me, the iBot is better than any dog because my grandfather died. The robot will never die. She'll never again know loss. In other words, the machine becomes better than anything, from better than nothing to better than anything that life could ever provide. And that movement in technology, from better than nothing to better than anything, is a very common trajectory. And you see it in psychotherapy. and psychoanalysis. Better than nothing because we can't see our patients, we're all in lockdown, to all of a sudden, I can see patients all over the world. People feel less vulnerable, so they're able to say things they wouldn't normally say. People like being able to be comfortable and at home and, be able to choose therapists, even if it's inconvenient. I feel more relaxed. And I can see things that I wouldn't necessarily see, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to, the details aren't important. And what's so upsetting about this is that in this conversation about what you can see and what you can experience in the virtual, what's left out is all that we lose. I'm touching my body. All that we lose when we're not making eye contact, when we're not feeling the physical presence, the smell, the taste of the other in the room. And one thing in particular, because I'm kind of looking at your face that comes to mind, is that in order for me to give you the feeling, and if you were a patient, for example, that I'm making eye contact with you, I have to look at that green light. I have to look at the camera. And that's what a therapist has to do to give the patient the feeling that they're looking at their eyes. But if I'm doing that, I'm not looking at the patient at all. I'm just looking at the green light. And if you tell a therapist, well, you're not looking at the patient at all if you're giving them the illusion of eye contact, they go, yeah, well,
So I asked a psychiatrist friend about this.
Yeah.
I heard about, she said, I think the brain corrects for this. We come to translate what we see through a program like this one. And we forgive your eye not looking straight at me, which is the translation of you're actually looking somewhere else.
I just don't want people to forget what they're losing.
Okay.
And that's my concern, is that we get wrapped up in the miracle that we've created, that, as Nicholas said, that we've been able to, make this work at all. And we forget that, there has been a loss, and we have to remember that once we're given the choice again.
I want you to talk about something you write in your memoir. You quote a young woman who you describe as an early Facebook enthusiast who explained her lack of concern about access to details about her online by asking rhetorically, who would care about me and my little life? And you write this: now we know the answer. When we are online and when we are tracked by our devices, our lives are bought and sold in bits and pieces to the highest bidder and for any purpose. When I first considered that question, who would care about me and my little life, it led me to ask whether we could have intimacy without privacy and whether we could have democracy without privacy. I argued that the answer was no, but I thought of them as two separate questions. I had a lot to learn.
Yes.
What did you learn about intimacy, privacy, and democracy?
Well, when I first started studying this, I thought that those were two separate questions. In other words, that Facebook was scraping your data. That was bad. And then there was a whole separate issue about polling and about influencing people in terms of their voting. Well, that was a problem. And over time, the kind of fact that we live in a surveillance society where, the way I see it now, intimacy, privacy, and democracy are in a kind of golden triangle, where the most important thing to teach our children is that you cannot have intimacy without privacy, you cannot have democracy without privacy, you cannot have, that these three, that surveillance will undermine privacy and democracy. And I think we've seen that. I think the pandemic, as we've watched this year, in which we've seen really a crisis in democracy. We've seen people have become more aware of what social media can do. I think we've seen that more people become aware that of this golden triangle, and of how much work we have to do to make ourselves whole again and protect ourselves. I think it's really the number one educational issue. And yet in my interviews, because I'm an honest interviewer, I report what I hear, young people will still say, Facebook is my free luxury. It's my free luxury. And they don't allow themselves to make the connection of what it's taking from them. Or they'll say something really off the point of this connection when they say, I don't mind being shown pictures for ballet slippers because, I like it that Facebook knows that I like that kind of ballet slipper. Mm-hmm. So educating people about this complex connection, really I see as the major, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, no matter what your politics is, we have to get this under control because, one of my favorite lines in all the things I've ever written was something I wrote for a TED Talk that said, just because we grew up with the internet, we think the internet is all grown up. And and people say, oh no, the horse is out of the barn, it's too late. It's, the internet is still young enough that we need to get this under control because I think our democracy really depends on it.
But I was thinking, the quotation from your book that I just read, yeah. I copied from one screen. I had emailed it from another screen, my Kindle, and I had checked, dates and things about you by going to your website on my smartphone screen. Are all of your concerns and misgivings about where we are in terms of our digital lives? Is it all within the context of having to accept the fact that this is where we're headed, that the only thing likely to change about the screens we use is that they become still more powerful and are able to do more things for us? No,
I'm talking about two different sets of concerns. When you talk about who would care about me and my little life,
yeah,
that concern is about the children growing up not understanding the surveillance nature of social media.
Yeah.
That's one set of concerns. I have a second set of concerns that have to do with the undermining of attention and empathy and the capacity for solitude by our constant distraction by our media. And I don't want to say that these exist in two separate universes because they don't, because the Facebook model keeps you online to get your data by keeping you constantly distracted. But that undermining of your capacity for solitude, where there are slots for iPads and baby bouncers and potty trainers, where people are asked to be alone, sitting quietly in a room for 15 minutes and they say, sure. And then after 6 minutes, they're willing to give each other electroshocks just to kind of perk it up. Where you have studies that if you put an iPhone on the table, turned off and turned up, turned face down, people will form a less empathic relationship with the people they're having lunch with just by the presence of a phone that's turned off. Mm-hmm. Those kinds of concerns really have to do with our paying more attention to our devices than each other. And that's a separate, track where I think we need to learn to live with these devices in a way that, keep us focused and able to pay attention to each other. So that's a kind of, I would say I have two. I began much like Virginia as a kind of techno enthusiast because I thought the internet was a place where people could play with identity in very interesting ways. And I I really changed my mind when I saw this undermining of the capacity for solitude, because it is in solitude that the capacity for empathy is born.
Sherry Turkle, thanks. And I'd like to call back now Virginia Heffernan and Nick Carr. I'd like to hear from each of you very briefly, remarking on something you've heard from your fellow panelists, starting with Nicholas Carr.
Sure. Virginia talked about the pleasures of computers and the pleasures of the internet. And those pleasures are real, and I've certainly experienced them, particularly in the early days of the internet. And Sherry, as she just talked about, has written about, and particularly in her earlier work, the playfulness of being in virtual communities. You can play with your identity, with yourself, and can be very constructive as well as fun. And those things are very, very important. My criticism is with the dominance of this medium. It's dominant over our persons, over our minds, because we're constantly interacting with it in a way that, as Sherry said, very much gets in the way of solitude. If you have a moment of solitude, you grab your phone and start socializing today. But also dominant culturally. It wasn't that long ago when, for information purposes, we had a radio and a record player and newspapers and magazines and books and televisions and all sorts of different devices and different technologies. And I think in many cases, they were better suited to the types of information that they transmitted. And now it's all collapsed into one thing that works in a very similar way. And I think we lose some of the richness of culture when we have this collapse into a single interface.
Okay. Virginia Heffernan, comments on what you've heard from your fellow panelists?
Well, first, I mean, all three of you are just such a pleasure to listen to, and just hearing you all think on your feet, both Professor Turkel and Mr. Carr, because I've read you for so long. So anyway, that's just a pleasure. But first off, Sherry, you did such a nice job evoking the kind of uncanny valley, especially eyes that don't track. I mean, that must be one of the very definitions of a failed affinity or failed attunement. No eye contact with a child, and simulating eye contact by, making the patient into the green light is just incredibly unnerving. When I've worked on VR, I've had people describe the experience of nausea that they have during many VR experiences as
virtual reality for the completely uninitiated. Yeah.
Virtual reality, exactly. That there's the nausea, like la nausea, is the primary response to the uncanny, and that is certainly the response I have to interfaces that try to trick you into thinking you're in reality. I much prefer, say, Twitter to Facebook. Twitter, little handles, birds everywhere, lots of signs, lots of strangeness, no pictures of your kids. That widens the gap, makes it more like a teddy bear than like a crazy creature in Polar Express. I can feel more kindly, more involved. It's a game. But something like this, where we're sort of talking to each other, we're sort of on a panel or a therapy session where you're sort of talking and you kind of half mistake it for a normal relationship you'd have with your analyst, that seems potentially very disturbing. So I really like the evocation of the uncanny. And Facebook to me is the real nightmare this way, using our real names, pictures of our kids. Why isn't this? Must be my aunt. I get into my place where I'm like, I'm with trusted family. And then all of a sudden I'm also being sold kind of strange QAnon language. And that's my absolute nauseating nightmare. And as for Nick, just like amazing warmth that Nick brings to the experience of kind of evoking and reminding us of culture without the internet, I think of you as having, Nick, I don't know, I can't see you. I should do a gallery view. I think of you as having the peripheral vision that our phones have cost so many of us, that you're not just constantly constricting your eyes around the little, I tried to see what happened in an eye when you look at the letter A on a screen. And it's like this one tiny muscle that most cultures never use, and it's not like yours hasn't been worked to death. I feel like you can like see over here, like picture you in Williamstown. And I love getting that perspective from you, because you're not just staring into your phone like a scared predator, like I sometimes find myself doing.
Okay. And Sherry Turkle, comments on what you've heard from Virginia Heffernan and Nick Carr.
Well, to Virginia, I wanted to say that when I want to have office hours with my students, I do it on the telephone.
Oh,
so
yeah.
We don't have to.
I remember that. I remember telephones.
Great.
We don't have to play this game. I'm in my kitchen. I'm in my kitchen. No, I'm going to make it look like outer space. And we can just kind of concentrate on that wonderful signal that is the human voice and all of its intonation and all of its richness. And it feels very intimate, and it feels as though we're really concentrating on each other. And to Nick, I wanted to add to his comment about artificial thinking you're a genius. I forget how you put it.
The delusion of intelligence.
Exactly. That heightened sense of smartness, that the original great experiments with multitasking showed that the more you multitask, the more you think you've accomplished, and the more you multitask, the less you accomplish, but the more you think you know. So people want to multitask more, and the more they do, the less they know. And so it's a kind of addictive cycle that as soon as you give people lots of windows and lots of multitasking and lots of computer power and lots of encouragement to use what this technology offers, people want to do more and more and more and more. And in fact, they end up knowing less and less and less and less, just by the fact that they are multitasking, having nothing to do with how smart they are, how much intelligence they're bringing to it, or just anything other than the fact that they're multitasking. So there's something about the very nature of the cognitive, because the brain doesn't know how to multitask. I mean, the brain wasn't told that this was going to be something. The brain just doesn't do that. So there's something very sad, really, very tragic in asking the brain to do this thing that like convinces the brain that it's getting smarter and smarter while it's making itself dumber and dumber. There's a kind of tragedy at the end of this. It's turtles all the way down.
Okay, some questions now from people who've been watching and listening, and this one is from Nell Minnow, who writes, "Thanks for the kind words about my dad, Newton Minnow. He has a lot of concerns about finding a balance between the right to privacy and some kind of accountability for incendiary or defamatory material. What tools would help us distinguish between fact-based content and disinformation about vaccines or election results without impinging on access for previously undeserved voices?" Who would like to try to answer that one? Virginia Heffernan.
I'll say a word partly because Nell, hello. I'm so happy to hear about your question. That's as close as I can get to you right now. I can't even see you on the screen. But I am very affected by, and I almost would like to circulate a link to an MIT study. I'm sure Professor Turkel knows it, about disinformation. And the short version of it is this: we circulate things not because, all things being equal, we circulate information, we circulate memes that are fictional. We have a preference for fiction over reality, not even ideological confirmation, but fiction. We love fiction. And things that are disgusting or hyper arousing, often snuff and porn come first. And just like Professor Turkel said about wanting to electrocute each other when we're on our own, we just want this crazy hyper arousal. So rather than sort of train our minds to sort out fact from fiction, because we're going to love fiction. We've always loved fiction. Mm-hmm. We're in a plague year. Storytelling is the name of the year. Read fiction as fiction. So the reason I think that these long Netflix series are so enchanting right now, they're just so lushly fictional. And so, you know, part of what
they're billed as fiction, though.
Right, that's what I mean. Read
fiction
as fiction, right? Better labeling of fiction online, not lies, but fiction, so that you can see what it's like to have a QAnon story that's not fan fiction, but that's fiction with characters and heroes and villains, and you know what that looks like. People read far too little fiction now. Guiding Light went off the air. I feel like everything ended when Guiding Light went off the air in 2008 or whatever it was. And then the second thing is mindfulness practices that cool off the nervous system, that bring down the need for cortisol, that allow you to sit quietly in long meditation, and quieter mental pleasures.
We're almost running out of time, and I guess what I'd just like to hear from the three of you in the briefest brief remarks is a sense of optimism or pessimism, where you are in the scale of our how we're relating to these innovations that are changing our lives. And Nick, we started with you, so why don't we start the last round with you as well?
Well, the short answer is pessimism. But let me say, we framed up this discussion in terms of technology versus people. And so the fact that we're framing this up as there being some kind of adversarial relationship, I think shows us that there's a problem in our relation with technology now. Because I'm a huge fan of technology. Technology is one of the joys of civilization. And done right, it opens the world more fully to us, to our explorations, to our understanding. Done wrong, it closes our horizons and distances us from the richness of the world and the richness of each other. And I think, unfortunately, in recent years, we've taken the latter path. We've adopted technology that is closing our horizons rather than opening them. And I would like to say, and I hope that we realize this and take a different route. But am I optimistic? No.
Virginia Heffernan?
I'd put people and technology on the same side in the people versus, and I might put something as old-fashioned a villain as market capitalism on the other side. So, I've thought of technology for a long time as the masculine form of the word culture. I don't know that there's all that much difference when you make, all that much difference in the role it plays in human civilization when you put poetry into Twitter doggerel, or you put doodles into graphics, or you put dance into YouTube videos. That all seems to still fall on the culture side of the ledger, as long as it takes place in symbols, words, music. But I do think that for what it's worth, I think the tech companies need to be broken up. Mm-hmm. I do advocate kind of hate speech regulations in the style of Germany. First Amendment be damned, or that's a longer conversation. But and also I love the way that screens have driven us much more deeply, and we don't talk about it enough during this pandemic, back to nature. Nature's been, we've been driven away from each other, but we've been driven much closer, I think, to trees, to our pets, and in some cases, because our children are staying home, our children. In any other time in history, would I have had a whole year in the company of my 15-year-old and 10-year-old, 11-year-old? No, because they'd be in school, they'd be out with their friends. Well, they're stuck here with me, and that has been good intimacy. So I'm optimistic that it's pushed us away in interesting ways, and I'm also optimistic that the kind of dialectic between people and technology on the one hand and the ever-present force of market capitalism on the other will continue to work in its dialectical way, if not ever upward, at least in interesting syntheses.
Thank you. And Sherry Turkle, you have the last word.
I'm not sure. I worry about the erosion of our capacity for solitude. Because if you don't have the capacity for solitude to sort of know who you are and be comfortable with that, when you turn to some other person, you try to get them to tell you who they are, to tell them who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't like people like that. We don't like people who don't know who they are.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to have a capacity for solitude, a sense of who you are, which only comes from the ability to be with yourself and not always be distracted. So then you can turn to somebody else and say, who are you? And that's where mutuality is born. So there's this great phrase in psychoanalysis, if you don't teach your children to be alone, they'll only know how to be lonely. And I worry that the technology inhibits our ability to be alone, thus inhibiting our ability to really listen to other people.
Mm-hmm.
And that ultimately that will leave us distractible, but lonely. So I'm very concerned about our constant state of agitation and distraction. And I'm with Virginia that I think the pandemic has been for some people a kind of breather. Even though we've been on screens all the time, we've also been able to get out into nature a little, calm down a little, kind of have a reset. Maybe it will make us embrace the human in a new kind of way.
Well, listen, Sherry, Virginia, Nick, thanks to all three of you for me, a very enlightening conversation about these challenges that technology poses. And many thanks also to Joshua Plout, Nate Bonzani, Roni Giuliano, all of the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. And also thanks to Bobby Grandone, who's our video and Zoom director. Our program sponsor is the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. It's a 501c3 national charitable organization that represents in the U.S. Israel's largest hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petach Tikva. It's Greater Tel Aviv. The website is www.afrmc.org. I'm Robert Siegel, and this has been Global Connections, Navigating the New Abnormal. See you next month. Stay healthy and stay safe.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.